The new president-elect Donald Trump has already outlined his second administration, and one of the big prizes is undoubtedly the Secretary of State, the authority in charge of piloting the international policy of the United States of America, one of the most influential and powerful positions on the face of the earth. And here, Trump has dealt us a surprise.
It is my great honor to announce that Senator Marco Rubio of Florida is hereby nominated to be the U.S. Secretary of State. Marco is a highly respected leader and a fearless warrior who will never back down to our adversaries.
Exactly. Marco Antonio Rubio is the person chosen to defend Uncle Sam's interests around the world. In Washington, this senator is described as a hawk, an uncompromising guy in the face of authoritarian regimes that dare to stand up to the United States. Of course, we're talking about Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, North Korea, among other countries held hostage by autocrats and thugs. The future Secretary of State has been aiming his cannons against this particular axis of evil for years.
But we are constantly reminded, in Nicaragua, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Russia, in North Korea, in Iran, in much of the Middle East, to be frank, and in many other parts of the world, including on the continent of Africa, that while freedom and liberty is a natural right, it is not natural. But the bottom line is that all this becomes endemic in our national security because ultimately, whatever happens in the region, it finds itself here. It finds itself here in our banking system. It finds itself here in our streets, both in the presence of drugs and these criminal organizations that migrate towards here.
Marco has always been one of those guys who thinks the United States has to move around the world with a knife between its teeth, ready at all times to nip the weeds in the bud, whatever the cost. Be that as it may, the point is that Rubio became one of Trump's favorite senators, and also one of the most detested profiles for 21st century socialism.
Boy, do we have great congressmen and senators here today. This guy Rubio is pretty good, isn't he, though? Huh? Because he has been a great senator, and he's a great guy. It's true, he's a great guy. Smart guy.
Con respecto a lo que diga Marco Rubio es un delincuente. En verdad, Marco Rubio es un delincuente. Que es senador en Estados Unidos, pero es un delincuente.
VisualPolitik community. I was counting on this senator somehow becoming part of the new Trump administration, but Secretary of State, that's a pretty big step. And above all, it's something that gives rise to some interesting reflections. Because, you see, yes, as his name already indicates, Marco Rubio is Hispanic. His parents came from Cuba to the United States right around the time of Fidel Castro's revolution. But that's the least of it. The main issue is that Rubio has been a senator for Florida since 2010. And during all this time, his career has essentially been built around Latin American policy, particularly as it relates to three countries, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, which is striking because during the campaign, Trump hammered over and over again with one very clear idea. America's only obsession has to be competition with China, China, and China. And yet, now, his new Secretary of State has a completely different profile. So the questions are pretty obvious, don't you think? Why was Rubio chosen by Trump? Does this selection mean that Latin America will play a very special role in this new administration? Has Rubio arrived to become the executioner of the Castro regime in Cuba and the Chavista regime in Venezuela? Well, things are getting very interesting. In this video, we'll try to answer all these questions, so buckle up and let's get started. There are rumors that Trump had other plans for Rubio when this election race got underway. According to behind-the-scenes rumors, which Rubio himself seems to have confirmed, the president-elect wanted him as no less than vice president, which was not possible due to the electoral rules. Because in the United States, the rule says that if the presidential and vice presidential candidates are from the same state, the state votes do not count in the electoral college. And of course, this was precisely the case with Trump and Rubio, two guys who, as well as having become colleagues in recent years, are neighbors in Florida, a state that contributes 30 votes to the Electoral College. So we don't know whether or not this story is entirely true, but it does seem pretty clear that this was a risk that the Republicans would never, under any circumstances, have taken. Be that as it may, the bond between Trump and Rubio these days seems close. Of course, it was not always so affectionate. In 2016, during the Republican primaries, they called each other names. But hey, it was a primary, so what can we expect? Of course, that's not all there was to it. Later, in the Senate, Rubio went after Trump's top foreign policy officials, accusing them of being too soft. Listen, for example, to how Rubio openly attacked then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in 2017, precisely around relations with Russia. Check it out.
The Vladimir Putin's military has conducted war crimes in Aleppo because it is never acceptable, you would agree, for a military to specifically target civilians, which is what's happened there through the Russian military. And, I find it discouraging, your inability to cite that. Are you aware that people who oppose Vladimir Putin wind up dead all over the world, poisoned, shot in the back of the head? And do you think that was coincidental, or do you think that it is quite possible, or likely, as I believe, that they were part of an effort to murder his political opponents?
We've already told you that Marco Rubio is a hawk who has earned the trust of the president-elect, and who is now to arrive at the Secretary of State's office with the credentials that make him a heavyweight in the new administration. However, for many analysts, this selection has come as a surprise. As I've already told you, Trump's great foreign policy promise has been, as well as stopping the war in Ukraine, to stop Xi Jinping's growing expansionism. And how the hell does Rubio fit in here? He's not exactly known for his relationship with NATO, nor for his position on the Ukrainian war, nor for his political stance towards China. So far, for the new Secretary of State, everything has basically been about Latin America, even the competition with China itself.
The Chinese are there for two reasons. The first is that they want access to mineral rights. They want access to rare earth minerals. They want access to those kinds of things. And the second is they want to have a geopolitical presence as a global power. And I think they want to turn the Western Hemisphere into what they believe we've done in Asia with Japan and South Korea and Australia and New Zealand and all these other allies.
Keep this idea in mind, because it could explain his logic to a great extent. Because you see, during Trump's presidency, the big international policy issues are likely to be taken directly to the White House. In fact, this would explain why the president-elect has already announced who will be the ambassador to Israel or the national security advisor, and that these profiles have nothing to do with the ones supposedly responsible for foreign policy. Well, under this prism, what Trump needs in the State Department is above all a kind of complement to his agenda. And this is precisely where this senator seems to gain strength. A senator who argues for a very particular position. According to him, just as the United States is building a military and political cordon against China in the Indo-Pacific, with AUKUS, with the Five Eyes, and the new relationship between South Korea and Japan, it's now necessary to do the same in Latin America. The Chinese must be expelled from the region, or at least their influence must be limited. Well, that would be a first clue, which, by the way, is closely related to a second suspicion. Is Trump chasing a quick political win? Come to think of it, if there's one issue that has consistently featured prominently in US foreign policy over the past 70 years, it has been precisely the situation with Cuba. Ending the Castro regime would be a jackpot that would go down in the history books, and something similar could happen with Venezuela. Because basically, the Chavista regime is the direct descendant of Castroism. Could this be the legacy that Trump is seeking? What's more, as you all know, if only because we've already told you about it on VisualPolitik, Trump got to the White House in large part due to the Hispanic vote. And trust me, many of these voters would like to see Washington weed out some of these Latin American dictators. I'm sure this is the case for many of you who are watching us from the United States, a country where we have a lot of members in this community, so surely this could be the case for you, right? Well, the fact is that Rubio has Maduro, Ortega, and Diaz-Canel in his crosshairs. Three guys who also happen to be China's best allies in the region. VisualPolitik community, the choice of Rubio to pilot the Secretary of State cannot be accidental. Pay attention to this, because here we can find many surprises.
One sheriff and 3 bad guys.
Logically, Marco Rubio has just been announced, so obviously we cannot yet know exactly what his agenda will be, but we do know something even more important. I'm talking about his record after 13 long years as a senator from Florida. This is something that tells us a lot about what we can expect. Rubio has been one of the senators who has presented the most bills to pressure and sanction the dictatorships of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. In this sense, he's been a real Rottweiler. For example, in December 2022, he promoted the draft law for the prevention of appeasement and financing of destabilizing regimes, a law that was not approved, but which sought to expressly prohibit the importation of crude oil and liquefied natural gas from Venezuela and Iran.
Then we also find the draft U.S. Investment Accountability Act, a proposal also introduced in late 2022 that sought to establish constant and comprehensive monitoring of business activity in China, Russia, Cuba, and Venezuela.
And it was also Rubio who promoted the Venezuelan Democracy Act, a comprehensive bill that called for more sanctions, humanitarian assistance, much more support for the opposition, and also reduced US funding to any international organization that maintains relations with Venezuela. Well, as I said, none of these bills have been passed, but all of them have been promoted by this senator in recent years. So you can imagine what his priorities will be when he takes the helm at the State Department. VisualPolitik community, Rubio is very clear that sanctions have been insufficient, and that political, economic, and financial pressure must be increased at all costs. Which, by the way, contrasts with the position that Donald Trump has argued in recent months. What am I talking about? Well, look at this.
I was a user of sanctions, but I'd put them on and take them off as quickly as possible because ultimately it kills your dollar and it kills everything the dollar represents, and we have to continue to have that be the world currency. I think it's important. I think it would be losing a war if we lost the dollar as the world currency.
And this brings us to a very interesting old chestnut. As we've told you here on VisualPolitik in recent years, during the Biden administration, the reins were loosened slightly with Venezuela to allow American companies such as Chevron to work more intensively with the PDVSA, the Venezuelan state-owned oil company, to increase crude oil production in the country.
This is something that suits the U.S. oil industry very well, because many of its refineries, especially those located in the Gulf of Mexico, are adapted to Venezuelan crude, which is much heavier than the sweet crude extracted within the United States. There are a lot of very significant investments and projects in this field.
For Rubio, however, this is almost sacrilegious. And the question is, who will get their way? The oil industry or Marco Rubio? Then another issue that came up as soon as the selection of the Secretary of State was announced was that of military intervention. And what is Rubio's opinion on this subject? Well, the truth, it depends on when you ask him.
Marco Rubio, U.S. military intervention could solve Venezuelan crisis. Rubio, I don't know anyone calling for U.S. military intervention in Venezuela.
VisualPolitik community, Marco Rubio has always been hesitant on the subject of possible military intervention. And what can I tell you? You ask us a lot about this matter, and perhaps we're wrong, but in spite of everything, the image of Marines going after Maduro doesn't seem very likely. Although, we'd have to see what happens in the case of Cuba. Be that as it may, if one thing is clear, it's that this election is the worst nightmare for the Castro, Chavista, Sandinista triad in Latin America. It's the worst news they've received in a long time. Because beyond the Marines, we can take it for granted that the pressure is going to increase. For Venezuelans, this election is probably much more important than the last elections of 28th of July organized by Maduro. I'm certain that this is not the best time for these tyrants, and that Maduro, well, let's just say he tried to send some goodwill message.
In his first administration, re-elected President Donald Trump, we did not do well. This is a new beginning for us to bet on winning. Today, I wish you luck in your government.
But Rubio's election? That seems to block everything. What do we think we can expect? More sanctions, more funding for the opposition, and many threats. Personally, I wouldn't be surprised if Trump wanted to cash in on a historic success. Remember, Trump lives in Florida, a state where there's one obsession above all: Cuba.
Cuba is again completely without electricity after failure of the recovery process of the electrical system.
Yes, this is a coin toss, but I believe we're looking at the best opportunity to see Castroism fall once and for all. Even so, along with the pressure on these despotic regimes, Marco Rubio has two other priorities in Latin America. What are we talking about? Well, listen up.
A Lone Ranger.
The first of these priorities has already been brought to your attention. China is accelerating its cooperation agreements with major public works and trade advantages throughout Latin America. The pace is really impressive.
China extends its trade route in South America with the megaport it is building in Peru. Paraguay is open to trade agreements with China, despite its ties with Taiwan.
At the moment, besides all the investments it's promoting, Beijing is also negotiating free trade agreements with Uruguay, Paraguay, Honduras, Panama, and El Salvador. In other words, Latin America suddenly seems to have an important territory for China. Why is that? Well, let's just say that this region has a lot of raw materials, relatively low wages, and also allows them to get in Washington's face. Well, in light of this new situation, Rubio has been advocating a very different roadmap. You see, from Rubio's perspective, it's clear that the United States cannot compete with China by financing works or providing loans. But on the other hand, there is something it could do. Provide incentives for large US multinationals to start investing much more in the region. According to the new Secretary of State, this would not only reduce Chinese influence, but would also have many advantages in terms of national security.
Latin America and the Caribbean provide valuable opportunities for nearshoring too. During the pandemic, we saw that depending on supply chains spread all across the globe places our economy and society in danger. It is high time we respond to these warnings by bringing critical manufacturing back to America, or, when that is impractical, to the Americas.
Precisely because of this senator has tried to get Congress to promote the relocation of US companies based in China to Latin America. Something that, honestly, what do you want me to say? Logistically, it could be done, but I honestly don't think they will get very far. Neither for legal security, nor for taxes, nor for social and political stability, nor for qualified professionals, nor for production networks or infrastructure. Is this an achievable dream right now? Well, perhaps the only exception is Mexico, a subject that we've already talked about here on VisualPolitik. But well, I insist. Obviously, something could be done, and it's likely that this will carry weight in Marco Rubio's new agenda. And the other major priority will, of course, be immigration and narcotics. In other words, Mexico and Central America. We've already told you about it here on VisualPolitik. This time, everything indicates that Trump is going to be much more forceful with these two issues. Basically, he's turned them into two of his big workhorses. And on the campaign trail, he hasn't shied away from issuing all kinds of warnings about Mexico.
If they don't stop this onslaught of criminals and drugs coming into our country, I'm going to immediately impose a 25% tariff on everything they send in to the United States of America.
And who better than a Hispanic to deal with all these issues? So, all indications are that the White House will be taking a huge lead in everything to do with Ukraine, Russia, the Middle East, and China. From this perspective, everything points to Rubio being a lone ranger with a very particular mission: bring order in Latin America and give Trump a historic victory for his legacy, while consolidating Trumpism among Hispanic voters. Of course, that may not be the case, and Marco Rubio may suddenly dazzle us with a much more international agenda, but I don't know. It wouldn't really fit with his record. But as we always say, nobody has a crystal ball. In any case, everything suggests that this is the worst news in the world for the Maduros, the Diosdado Cabellos, the Diaz-Canels, and the Ortegas. Now, for the first time, they're going to have a Secretary of State turned against them. From VisualPolitik, we wish Donald Trump's new Secretary of State very, very good luck. In this case, his successes will be everyone's successes. The question is, what exactly do you think Marco Rubio's top priorities will be? What do you think of his being selected? What would you do about Cuba and Venezuela? Leave us your impressions in the comments and let's start a debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much for being there. All the best. See you next time.